The main question for us in terms of inspiring our students is what inspires each of you to continue pursuing your work and advocacy. We'll start with Dr. Rice. What inspires you?
For me, it has to do fundamentally with just love. And I was raised in such a way that I define myself in terms of the degree to which I can love my way through the darkness before the worms get me. And I will be successful to the degree to which I'll be able to leave some example of being concerned about others and serving others and helping others. Learned that in my church, learned that in my family, and I decided to be faithful unto death in terms of that particular conception of what it means to be human. So I love wisdom, I love knowledge, I love the party. I do. But I love justice. But in love and justice, I'm not loving an abstraction. I'm loving human beings who are suffering and shuddering and trying to make it through life. And you want to be of whatever service you can be in light of the limited forms of weaponry you have available to you. So I'm on a love train. I'm on the caravan love.
Thank you, Dr. West. What are some of the benefits of being an activist? Dr. West.
I find great joy in struggle. It's like John Coltrane playing a song 14 hours and going to sleep with a horn in his mouth and wake up blowing. Keep on joy and blowing. And why did Coltrane blow? What is Love Supreme all about? He's trying to touch your soul. He's trying to uplift you. He's trying to enhance himself as he finds joy in spreading love through his horn. Man, I'm a Coltrane follower. That's a way of being in the world. So there's great joy. Now, granted, you're going to have enemies. Well, I come from a tradition that says love your enemies, which means you're going to have a whole lot of enemies when you take a stand. Get used to it. It goes with the territory. Don't be surprised if you take a stand for poor people and lo and behold, you have enemies. Bring them on. That's what Jesus was saying. Bring them on. If you love folks, you're going to have tons of enemies. Because there's a lot of cowards who hate. Hatred ain't nothing but the coward's revenge against those who intimidate you. They try to intimidate you. They try to make sure that you feel afraid and you take a stand with your joy and bring the enemies on. All they can do is kill you. That's all they can do is kill you. And the joy I'm talking about brings a certain death to death itself. If that's all they can do is kill you, then you're a free human being. You free to tell the truth. You free to bear witness. You free to cut against the grain. Now, if they mess with my mama, I'm a Christian but not a pacifist.
Why is it difficult to unify groups and coalitions with the same goals? And is it easier now when compared to previous decades? So, Dr. West, you may have the previous decades piece a little more in hand than some of the other panelists.
I'm certainly older than everybody up here. Well, I mean, I think that we all know that it's going to take a coalition of people with courage and vision, of different colors and different genders and sexual orientations to engage in any kind of change. That's why the human has to be at the center of what people call
common humanity.
But we have to be honest, of course, about the divisions that are already in place. That we still live in highly racially segregated and class segregated communities. So we're not used to spending a lot of time with each other when it comes to different colors and different classes in struggle. The 1960s was a period in which you had people like Martin King, people like Huey Newton, people like Fannie Lou Hamer, who believed in multiracial, multicultural coalitions. And they were highly successful to the degree to which they broke the back of American apartheid, Jim Crow, American terrorism. But many of them were also murdered, many of them were also lied on, many of them were also pushed to the edges. And so people figured, well, on the one hand, I'm not really used to being in a context of multiracial struggle. I'm certainly not used to telling the truth about class inequality and wealth inequality. I'm not really used to talking about American imperial policies. So that there's a sense in which we're inexperienced and relatively unexposed to these contexts of struggle. And we understand that, but we have to have that if in the end we're going to deal with stopping for this, we're going to deal with mass incarceration, class incarceration, and so forth.
Is there one book that you would suggest that they read in order to help them along that journey? We're going to start with Dr. West.
Just one, huh?
Just one.
Just one. I think these days, I would say read Sister Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow.
For those students in the audience who fear the consequences or need a little bit more encouragement to take a more active role, what advice would you give them? Wes.
First, I would begin with students taking a more active role in your studies. If you're here for 4 years, not here that long, you want to make sure that you are as well grounded in an understanding of history, a perspective from the bottom up, a perspective from the wretched of the earth, a perspective from people who are catching hell. So you got to understand working people's history. You got to understand black people's history. You got to understand indigenous people's history. Understand why the Chinese were sent back to China after they built the railroad. Understand why it is that women couldn't vote till 1920. The perspective of history has to do with terror, trauma, and stigma, and how these peoples were able to sustain themselves. If you're in Europe, you're going to deal with Jewish brothers and sisters. Hated, pogroms, thrown in concentration camps. How did they sustain themselves in Jew-hating Europe? If you're in Japan, you don't understand the Koreans. Why did the Japanese subjugate the Koreans in that way? A perspective of history from bottom up, but especially looking at the role of the children. Because all of us here share one thing. At one time, we were children. Innocent, childlike sense of awe, wonder, adventure, and look at us now. And we said, what happened? How did we get so wounded? How did we get so bruised? How did we get so jaded? How did we get so narrow in our imagination? What happened? I mean, what separates somebody like Immortal technique as an artist is a great artist remains childlike without being childish. You see? So that no matter how old they get, listen to Curtis Mayfield's last album he did with Robert Trout, A Zap Band, A New World Order. That genius is as involved in wonder as he was when he wrote Gypsy Woman in the early 60s. That's what it is to be on a love train of wisdom and justice. So I would say to young folk, make sure you're deeply rooted in your studies, and make sure you are organized with at least one group that's connected to something outside of the university. To get outside of the bubble, get outside of the bubble. But stay in the library, in the laboratory, for a while.
For the students who have difficult course loads and are assisting in all of these levels of activism, how do you find the time to manage all of that at the same time?
I think that's a question I should ask the students, so I can learn. I never had to do that. But I would just say to the students that always remember, there was a young Negro genius from Harlem named James Baldwin, who never went to college, but the college went through him. He became the finest essayist in the English language of the middle-late part of the 20th century. So he grew up in poverty-ridden conditions, but he had courage, he had vision, and he knew how to manage his time such that he produced works that people will talk about 100, 200, 300 years from now. So let him be an inspiration when you're wrestling with your poverty and your time and your work. I just think it's very clear that the system under which we live is failing poor and working people. It's not working. We talk, if 22% of our children live in poverty, it's not working. If we go to each city, you can see 1 out of 3 of our young Christian black brothers either on parole, probation, or in prison is not working. So the question then becomes either reform, which means somehow we have to get courageous insiders who are going to push through policies to help alleviate the suffering, or we need revolution. Now, I am a revolutionary Christian. I come out of Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy. The brother was a revolutionary. That's why they killed him. Nope. He called for revolution of values, a revolution in power, a shift from the power of oligarchs and plutocrats toward those don't call everyday people. And how you engage in that, you want to be democratic and nonviolent and so forth. That's my tradition. But at least I have to be honest and say, what we living under now is a nightmare for poor people. It's a nightmare for too many working people who are dealing with stagnating wages, but when the profits go up, the well-to-do keep the profits. And the wealth is hemorrhaged at the top. So in that sense, yes, but then the question becomes, what kind of revolution? As soon as you say revolution on television, you get 150 death threats because they figured that you got M16s in your garage. Yeah. And so, so they just got to be honest about it and just tell the truth. Say, yeah, we need a revolution. We need a revolution in the legacy of those who recognize that there either can be democratic transfer of power, or then we have contestation, which means we go to hit the street, we go to jail, we get killed or whatever it is. But we have to be honest about just how nightmarish it is. Think about it. 2.4 million young brothers and sisters have been stopped and frisked since 2002. Now, if that's the only way you can reduce crime in New York City, is to stop and frisk 2.4 million young black and brown men primarily, but you got some white brothers and sisters too, and some women too, then we got to be more creative. We will not put up with our young people being stopped and frisked 1,800 times a day. That's pathological. That's not just. And it's not in the Constitution. I think we just have to be very candid about the fact that no one individual ever carries the gravitas of hope for any kind of change. And Obama is a centrist neoliberal who had a Wall Street government. He was loyal to Wall Street. Wall Street was not loyal to him. He bailed out banks but not homeowners. He didn't mention poverty for 4 years. He wouldn't mention it during the campaign at all. And every Tuesday when the killer list is presented to him and he makes the choices as to who he's going to kill, he's committing war crimes. Those are war crimes. 4,000 people have been killed. 13% of those killed are terrorists. There are 182 children. There are over 35% innocent. Those are war. When Truman dropped bombs on innocent people in Japan, those were war crimes. Thank you. When Hamas killed Israelis, innocent, those are war crimes. When the Israeli state killed precious Palestinians in the West Bank who are innocent, those are war crimes. Let's be honest about it. And they say, oh, you hate on the brother. No, I love the brother. He's a war criminal with a Nobel Peace Prize. We need to know that, and let's stop dropping bombs on innocent people. And I say it for this. You see, I come out of a tradition when Emmett Till's mother had to speak to the world when her innocent child was killed by cowardly white supremacists, cowardly American terrorists. She could have said, we're going to kill some innocent white folk across the board because a lot of them probably know what's going on. And she said, no. That's my tradition. You don't kill innocent people. I don't care what color it is. I don't care you're in the White House, on the corner, or any other nation. So we just have to be honest. We can't get used to having these kind of crimes committed and think that that doesn't devour our souls in terms of becoming conformist with that kind of criminality. No matter what color they are, that's the tradition we talk about. Yeah, we need a seminar for your question. A blessing to see you though. I've heard so many things. But no, what I would like to have is a system of deep and profound democracy where the voices of poor and working people are heard at the highest level in decision-making processes. So that means democracy at the workplace. That means rights and liberties are protected. No
Yes,
matter
which is a form of classical liberalism, correct?
No, not at all. Not at all, because classical liberalism is tied to private property and is tied to bosses who have an asymmetric relation of power to workers.
Yes, sir.
So that there's elements of liberalism to the degree to which I think rights and liberties. I want to make sure I protect your right to be right and your protected right to be wrong. Rights and liberties. My right to be right, my right to be wrong. That's very important. But at the same time, it goes far beyond liberalism in terms of, I think we ought to dismantle big banks. If they're too big to fail, they ought not to exist. They ought to be community banks across the board that are tied to commercial saving, not investment in a casino. But that's still democratic. It's deeply democratic, so it proceeds based on the best of a commitment to rights and liberties, but it puts poor and working people, not big banks and big corporations and big money, at the center of how our society is organized. That's a big thing.
Parallels they see between the administrative detention systems in Israeli prisons against Palestinians and the mass incarceration here in the U.S., mostly against minorities. That's the question.
Well, one, I think we have to begin with the occupation. See, I'm against occupation. White folk occupying black folk occupying white folk. If there were a Palestinian occupation of my precious Jewish brothers and sisters, I'm in solidarity with Jewish resistance against Palestinian occupation. Right now, there's an Israeli occupation. Palestinians, I'm against occupation. Under occupation, you get all kinds of apartheid-like activities that does not acknowledge the dignity, beginning with the children, the dignity of the human beings in that situation. So that we have to put the occupation at the center of it. Now, one of the reasons why I keep coming back to Hamas, even when you resist, you don't kill innocent folk. But then the Israeli state comes back and kills 10 times those innocent folk, and you end up with this vicious, pathological cycle of war crimes. And we have to call it that for what it is and acknowledge what precious Palestinians are undergoing given this Israeli occupation. We have to join with our progressive Jewish brothers and sisters, help them become even more courageous. There's many progressive Jewish brothers and sisters who were there and occupied and said, in the Israeli occupation, because they've taken a moral stand. They have ethical content to who they are, but at the same time, rightly, they're concerned about safety of Jewish brothers and sisters. They have a fundamental right to that safety because they've been cheated, they've been trashed, they've been killed for 2,000 years. And the challenges in the occupation, security for Jewish brothers and sisters, justice for Palestinians, and trying to be honest about ensuring that innocent folk on both sides don't have to pay the price. Love for people who hated themselves.
That's right.
And what he wanted to do was to de-niggerize black people. And once you are niggerized, you become not just self-hating. Bob Marley understood this. You are afraid, you are intimidated, you defer to powers that be, you scratch when it don't itch, you laugh when it ain't funny, and put on your mask, and you're never a threat. And what he wanted to do was unleash. What did he have on the newspaper? Islam dignifies. Be dignified. Be a human being. Take a stand. Straighten your back up. Love yourself. Do for self. And I'm going to produce some of the most bold and fearless leaders, beginning with Mao, that black America had ever seen. And I'm going to do it in a quiet way, organizing these deniggerized Negroes into strong, black, self-loving folk. Now, I disagree with the fact that he early predicated it on calling white folk devils. He's wrong about that, but he was highlighting devilish behavior. Now, he got a lot of evidence for that. White supremacy in the middle part of the 20th century, saw his relative lynched in Georgia. Whole lot of devilish activity out there. He just made an inference that we don't have to make. White folk not devils. They human beings. You know what? All of us have gangster proclivities and devilish proclivities. But what he did was, he said, in the midst of this Negro-hating civilization, I'm going to risk my life and love these folk enough to tell them to straighten their backs up. You don't have to be niggas. You can be a black woman, man, self-loving, and what happened? He ended up producing folk who moved through his organization and become critical of him. But without him touching them, they wouldn't have had the strength to even become critical of him. And Elijah Muhammad deeply shapes elements of who I am. And I come from Shiloh Baptist Church. And remain in Shiloh Baptist Church. But will testify to his impact in terms of shaking the nigger out of me and deniggerizing me. It's that fundamental. I think John Elijah Muhammad.
It's hurting their government. Listen, America hasn't won a war since World War II. Empires don't collapse because you lose wars. They collapse when people stop believing in them. And that's what we're confronted in right now. People are going to stop believing in America if it becomes so corrupt that it's a caricature of itself and a laughing stock around the rest of the world.
Simply by standing up and refusing to be ignorant, by letting them know we're not fooled, that false flag operations won't work on us anymore, that we're not duped.